Well, good morning, everybody. Why don't we go ahead and get started? So if you did not know already, welcome to Treasure Hunt. My name is Carl Skooglund. And again, if you did not know already, the idea with this class is to explore the earliest known teachings of the Buddhist tradition as they're preserved in what is known as the Pali Canon. And we're here not just to conceptually understand all the ideas and concepts, it's to see how the teachings can be put into practice and, applied in our own experience, used as a guide in our lives. And as part of our exploration of this 2,500-year-old tradition, these 2,500-year-old teachings, for over a year now, we've been studying the well-known Satipatthana Sutta, the teaching on the foundations of mindfulness, or the establishings of mindfulness. And some of us are coming off a special, you might say, morning session in which we did what you might call a tour bus ride of the Satipatthana Sutta, which we kind of reflected on all the foundations, or all the facets, rather, in that discourse from start to finish. If I had any sort of a virtual ribbon to give out to those, I would. But it's also recorded, for those of you who might not have been able to make it, but are interested. So we've been at the Satipatthana for almost a year. We're coming actually to the last part, the very last part, the Four Noble Truths. We'll be doing that in February. But for this morning, I thought we might take the time to step back a little bit, and sort of in New Year fashion, take a broad look. So in particular, there are actually two things that I want to do in this morning's session. The first is that coming off that year of studying the text, that particular text, of working with the Satipatthana, what I want to do this morning is also point out how mindfulness comes up in the rest of the early teachings. Because even as deep and as wide as this one teaching is, the canon actually has a lot more to say about mindfulness, about what it can do for us, how we can put it into practice. So I hope to round out the portrayal of what mindfulness is. And then the other thing, just to say, is, one of the goals actually of this class is to understand how the early tradition is unique. So the second thing I'd like to do this morning is to show how early portrayals of mindfulness might appropriately, usefully be distinguished from contemporary portrayals. I do this not with the idea of being doctrinaire or fundamentalist about the early teachings. Instead, I hope to clear up any confusion that you might have, in encountering various interpretations of what mindfulness is, and thereby allow you to practice with a little more confidence, be a little more assured in how you engage in practice. But by the end of the talk, after having kind of teased apart the two approaches, contemporary and early, I want to refer us back to the Buddha's very first teaching, after he became enlightened, because I think that teaching allows us to stitch the two approaches back together again. So to start, let me briefly summarize what I think could reasonably be described as the contemporary portrayal of mindfulness. Now, first, one of the most common things that's said about mindfulness is that it's non-judgmental. Now, somewhat similar to that, mindfulness is also said to be non-interfering, non-controlling. And the flip side of these qualities, you might say, is that mindfulness is said to be accepting. It is said to be allowing. And the general idea is that we're to simply be with things as they are. For example, one recent writer said that in being mindful, we sit back and watch the show. We also hear that mindfulness is bare attention. And maybe the most common portrayal overall in contemporary circles is that mindfulness is nothing other than bare awareness. Okay, so with this contemporary approach, we're not making any judgments. We're allowing things to be as they are. We're not taking any action. Mindfulness seems to be something along the lines of scientific observation, in that the scientist is open to what's true and doesn't want to impact what's being seen, and instead wants to see what the system kind of does on its own. We're watching an object apart from ourselves. So that's a very brief and generalized description of how mindfulness is portrayed, I think, in most contemporary settings, both Buddhist and secular. What strikes me is how all of these descriptions paint a picture of mindfulness as being fundamentally passive in nature, right, and fairly narrow in scope. What I want to do now, though, is offer up a number of portrayals of mindfulness that we find not just in the Satipatthana, but elsewhere in the Pali Canon, elsewhere in the early texts. And what I think will be clear is that in the early tradition, mindfulness is fundamentally active in nature. It's proactive. And it's highly variegated. It has many facets. So to start with, the first text I want to point out, it's called the Nagara Suta. And in it, in this particular text, there are a number of things going on in the text, but in it, mindfulness is compared to the gatekeeper of a fortress. And what mindfulness does as this gatekeeper, drawing in its equivalent activity in the mind, is that mindfulness is said to allow skillful states to come into the mind and guard against states that do us harm. Just as a gatekeeper at a fortress would do. So you can see that this one right off the bat, that mindfulness is quite the opposite of being non-judgmental. And it's not that mindfulness is judging in the sense of being hard-hearted. It's more in the spirit of being discerning, and figuring out what helps and what hurts. The next sutta is the Anapanasati Sutra, the likewise famous mindfulness of breathing sutta, almost as famous as the Foundations of Mindfulness Sutta. And in it, it outlines a very deliberate process of practice. And one thing in particular that it does one particular thing that it does that I want to point out is that it repeatedly talks of training ourselves, repeatedly talks of training our minds. And it repeatedly uses the phrase, I will, I shall. And with both of these aspects, training and the use of the phrase I will and I shall, it points to how we set a clear intention. We're setting a clear intention to bring about and develop skillful experiences. In two other suttas, two separate suttas, in one, mindfulness is described as being like someone plowing a field. And in another sutta, mindfulness is said to be like a charioteer. Now, in both of these similes, the figures are taking action. Mindfulness is guiding and steering a vehicle, in a particular direction, keeping the vehicle on course. In the Mindfulness of Body Sutta, the Kaya Sutta, the Kayasati Sutta, there's a simile. We find a simile there of a bathman. And in that, the bath person is working pleasure into the body like one would work water into a ball of soap in order to make concentration happen. And what this simile does is, it sets up the image of an expert who's really good at something, and trying to make something particular happen. Fulfilling, acting on a particular purpose. And in another sutta called the Samiti Sutta, mindfulness is said to govern our thoughts and our intentions. Mindfulness governs our thoughts and our intentions. So in that, it's mindfulness that decides what we do. Right? So mindfulness could be said, to act in the capacity of executive function. And in the Andakavinda Sutta, mindfulness is said to be our protector, our chief, guarding the senses. And if you're not familiar with that term, guarding basically means keeping track of what your mind makes with raw sense input. The idea that mindfulness protects us by making sure our mind doesn't make things in a way that causes us harm. Right? Mindfulness is our protector in chief, guarding our senses. In a sutta called the Great 40, it says that one is mindful to abandon wrong view and enter into right view. And it says, if you're familiar with the Eightfold Path, it says the same thing about intention, speech, action, and livelihood, the other parts of the Eightfold Path. So again, mindfulness maintains the intention of abandoning the unskillful and developing what is skillful. And in the Sachita Sutta, translated as one's own mind, it starts out with an image of a young man or woman looking into a mirror and seeing a smudge or something on their face. And it points out how that young man or woman would immediately try to wipe it off. And next, the text goes on to say that in the same way, one should put forth desire, effort, diligence, enthusiasm, indefatigability, mindfulness and alertness for the abandoning of unskillful qualities of mind. So if we see the hindrances or other unskillful states arise, then we're to make an effort and apply mindfulness and alertness to relieve ourselves of them. So I think it's interesting to point out that in the early tradition, unskillful mind states were not to be looked on with equanimity. Equanimity was more in the realm of receiving verbal abuse and being in challenging physical conditions. That's where equanimity was reserved. We're not to be equanimous in relation to unskillful states of mind. And, you know, going back to that analogy of the smudge on the face, you know, I also like to think with this one sometimes, you know, how if I'm looking in the mirror and I see something stuck in my teeth, you know, I immediately want to get it out. You know, there's a gut reaction. I want to get that thing out of there. And so what the teaching is pointing us to in a way is, you know, that's how we want to, you know, respond when we see our minds creating something that's not so good. We're going to say more about this later, because I know it raises some concerns. Another thing is that in at least 4 of the texts that I know, that I can find, it says this about mindfulness. Mindfulness remembers and recollects what was done and said long ago. Now, this points back to the root meaning of the Pali word sati, which means memory. It means recollection. So sati is the function of bringing something to mind. Bringing something to mind rather than passively observing what happens to come into mind. Next, in the Sika Sutta, mindfulness is said to keep track of what parts of the path we have yet to develop. And then mindfulness guides us to develop them. So in being mindful, you know, we're not just going with the flow, right? As mundane as it sounds, you know, mindfulness keeps track of our spiritual agenda, you know, our spiritual do list. You know, keeps track of what good things could I make within myself and what good things that, you know, what good things could I strengthen. So that's a brief summary of how mindfulness is portrayed in some of the other early texts in the canon. Again, rather than being passive, mindfulness in the early tradition is proactive. You know, it's robust and has many facets. And then finally, even within the Satipatthana itself, you know, what we have been studying for this year, I think it's helpful to see that the approach that it takes, you know, acknowledge, recognize, the approach it has us take is that we're to establish mindfulness, you know, within particular realms of experience. They being, you know, body, feelings, mind states, and dhammas. You know, it's not about just being mindful of our streams of consciousness. And as we've said, mindfulness is sometimes defined as awareness, as bare awareness. But one teacher, Thanissaro Bhikkhu, he likes to point out that the Buddha made a distinction between mindfulness and awareness, with sati being one thing and sampajanya being another. Sati being the translation, or mindfulness being the translation of sati, and awareness being the translation of sampajanya, both of which we find in the sutta. What happens is sati recalls something, remembers something, right, brings it to mind, and then sampajanya is clearly aware of it, clearly comprehends it. And the point is that in the early tradition, mindfulness is not the same thing as awareness. And just as an aside, you know, mindfulness is also often defined or equated with attention. And in particular, mindfulness is often defined as being bare attention. But again, the Buddha had another term for attention, and that was manasikara. And furthermore, in the early teachings, attention was never really described as being bare. Instead, it was either described as being yoniso or ayoniso, which gets translated as appropriate or inappropriate. or careful or careless attention. Right? In the early tradition, attention was never bare or open-ended. And in the very first section of the body, in the Satipatthana, there are those breathing instructions, training thus, I shall breathe in and out. I shall breathe in and out, sensitive to the body, calming the body. Right? The instructions portray a deliberate, proactive intention here, right? And there's also that simile in the first section that goes like this. Just as a dexterous lathe turner discerns, I make a long turn or a short turn, so too the practitioner discerns, I make a long breath, a short breath. I'm sensitive to the body. I am calming the body. So in this simile of the woodworker, the woodworker does not simply allow the cutting bit to fall on the wood wherever it happens to fall. Instead, the worker shapes the wood in a particular way with a purpose in mind. And furthermore, in the refrain of the Satipatthana, we contemplate not just what randomly happens to come up, based on our old mental karma. Instead, we contemplate particular realms of experience, as I've said before. But with the refrain, we bring to mind how the range of experiences in the Satipatthana applies to ourselves, how they apply to others, how they apply to all of us, how they're impersonal. And in the next sections of that refrain, which I think happens about 13 times, it has us contemplate arising and vanishing factors for what we're contemplating, right? So it has us contemplate conditionality, why experiences happen the way they do. That's quite an active process we're engaging in our experience. And even the part of the refrain in which we exercise bare knowledge, right? It's done in regard to a particular theme. It's done in regard to a particular subject. So the point of all this is that in Satipatthana, we're not being choiceless in our awareness. That's not to discount that whole method, but in Satipatthana, that's not the tactic that we find. So instead of allowing the mind to channel surf, we bring something to mind that will help us. And then we keep it in mind, and we consider it deeply. So overall, that is the contrast, as I see it, that I think can appropriately and usefully be made between contemporary and early mindfulness. In short, one is passive and one is proactive. Now, having seemingly created a chasm between the two modes of mindfulness, I'd like to try to stitch them back together and to build a bridge between the two of them. And I want to do this by recalling the Buddha's very first teaching, again, after he awoke. And this first teaching is recorded in a text called the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which is translated as setting in wheel the motion of the Dhamma. And in this famous first teaching, the Buddha outlined the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths were his first teaching. And in case you don't know, the Four Truths are the truth of dukkha, usually translated as suffering. Second truth is the cause of dukkha. Third truth is the end of dukkha. And the fourth truth is the path leading to the end of dukkha. So that's the more famous part. But the part that doesn't get a lot of airtime is that in that first teaching, he outlined tasks that were associated with each truth. And those tasks being that were to comprehend, were to abandon, realize, and develop. And in particular, were to comprehend dukkha, the first noble truth, and were to abandon the cause of dukkha, the second noble truth. Were to realize the end of dukkha, the third noble truth, and were to develop the path, the fourth noble truth. So that being the case, here's how I think the two modes, contemporary and early, can be brought together, as parts of the path. And that is that I think that the contemporary version of mindfulness, in my mind at least, aligns with the task of the first noble truth, which is to comprehend dukkha. And so with that, we take the time to pause, to listen and to understand. Now, it is somewhat passive in nature, but even then, we're feeling our way into what's happening, within ourselves and those around us, like a good doctor making a diagnosis, we should be patient. We should ask lots of good questions, and like a good doctor, we can be patient with ourselves, and ask ourselves, where does it hurt? Right? And we and see what we discover. But we don't, as part of the entire path, we don't leave our efforts to just comprehension, any more than we want to go to a doctor and, would want us to have them only tell us what's wrong with us and recommend that we just be with it. Right? Instead, we want the doctor to go on and tell us how to feel better. And here's where I think the early version of mindfulness comes into play, in that I think it has us take the actions, the appropriate actions in relation to what hurts. In this sense, I think the Buddha was very pragmatic and commonsensical, just like a good doctor would, recommend to us that we stop doing, what hurts and start doing what helps. So, I'm not proposing that we stop doing contemporary mindfulness, but perhaps it would help to look at it in a different light, look at it in the light of the first noble truth, which is to comprehend, everything from our deepest sorrows and longings, to all of life's incessant irritations. And for those of us who have been on the path for a while, we know that it's not a matter of checking the box of the first part and then moving on to the next. It's not a linear process. It doesn't ratchet only in one direction. Instead, there's a constant interplay between understanding and acting. We comprehend, then we let go. Then we go back and we comprehend, and then maybe we develop. We comprehend some more, we go back and forth again and again. In addition to the doctor analogy, a model that I've come to create for myself that combines, I think, these two portrayals of mindfulness is that of a gardener. So on the one hand, a gardener takes the time to assess the environment. Right? We take the time to pause and try to understand, the current state of things. This is a really important part of practice. But the next step is that, we remove and prevent what we don't want in the garden. And then we plant and we nurture what we do want in the garden. This is the fundamental nature of right effort. there is definitely a time in which we want to watch in order to understand what's happening, in order to understand what effects our actions are having. We don't want to just rush in and start doing stuff. But the greater part of being a gardener, I think, is that, we interact with the environment, right? We shape the environment to fulfill a set of purposes. A gardener acts based on a certain set of intentions. Now, as practitioners, you might say that we interact with the environments of our own mind. We interact with the environments of our own mind, helping to bring about certain beneficial things that would not otherwise happen in the raw wilderness. But as I said before, there's a constant interplay, between comprehension and acting. But in either case, we take an active role in the unfolding of our experience. So now what I'd like to do is take some time to address two concerns that commonly arise when people encounter the early teachings and all this, proactivity that I'm talking about. All this, active intervention. The first concern has to do with what you might call the seeming, manipulation and striving that the texts seem to abdicate. And the second concern is how the texts seem to have us suppress what we perceive to be parts of ourself, parts that we really should embrace, because they make us human. So first, this idea of robust intervention. It can seem to be a repeat of the manipulative, control freak, type A personality types of behavior that a number of us, had actually hoped that this path would relieve us of. Okay, robust intervention, may also remind us of those internal and external voices we may have encountered in our lives, that say we're not good enough, we should be trying harder, more productive, we should be a better person, right? Some of us know it as the self-critical drumbeat of self-judgment. And to counteract these tendencies does make a lot of sense. The recommendations that we hear to drop judgment, relax and allow things to be as they are. These can be very excellent, very helpful, compassionate gateway instructions, you might say. They allow us to stop and take a breather from the habits that we might bring to the cushion. But I guess the way I see it is that if we take these initial instructions to their extreme, if we only steer left and we never steer right, then our practice might accidentally become, the equivalent, the unintentional equivalent of floating down the river in an inner tube. We just go with the flow, and we don't make the connection. What I think is the fundamental assumption of the early texts, and that is that experience is not something that is just happening. Experience is not something that's just happening. Instead, the assumption, indeed the observation of the early text, is that we create the experiences that we're having. We create the experiences that we're having. And as you might know by now, I love to quote the first verse of the Dhammapada, which goes, "All experience is preceded by the mind, led by the mind, made by the mind." Experience is preceded by the mind, led by the mind, made by the mind. So if our fundamental assumption is that we're creating experience, which is the assumption of the early texts, then it only makes sense to, take hold of the reins, you might say, in a way that a charioteer might, in order to guide, in order to steer ourselves in a direction that's beneficial rather than letting our old karma, our old habits steer us in a direction that's harmful. So that we're creating our experience rather than being passive receivers, this is the very reason that it's possible to be free. And I believe that this fundamental assumption that, that we make our experience lies at the root of the early tradition's emphasis on staying vigilant, guarded, heedful of our thoughts, words, and deeds, on making an effort to abandon, and to not make what causes harm, and to develop, to make what helps us. So the second concern about the early teachings is that they seem to have us suppress things that we consider make us human. They suppress parts of ourself. In general, I think it's helped to consider, the sometimes unacknowledged basis of a lot of our Western modes of thinking and valuing. And in this particular case, I think the most applicable mode, to what we're talking about, is the Western Romantic tradition. And Romanticism, you may or may not know, is in it. There's the strong valuing of emotion, a valuing of strong emotion. It has us want to feel the vitality of life. Strong emotion is the vehicle for feeling the vitality of our life. It also, the Romantic tradition is also what has us value feeling over thinking. As was said in Star Wars, trust your feelings, Luke. Romanticism also urges us to integrate the rejected parts of ourself and feel our interconnection with what might be termed the organic unity of the world around us. The goal of one of the primary goals of the Romantic tradition, or sets of goals, is interconnection, oneness, wholeness. So in that light, anger, grief, and longing are part of that whole. They're part of what makes us human. They make us feel alive. And in fact, if we don't feel these things, we may fear that life will become, bland, flat, neutral. So with the Romantic tradition as a backdrop, when we hear teachings that seem to point to abandoning parts of who we are, we have a really strong feeling, a strong gut reaction that is wrong. It's not something we should be doing. So these are some of the perceptions, some of the points of view that shape our fundamental perspective, I think, of who we are and what's valuable in life. The early tradition, Buddhism's early tradition, comes at these issues from a really different perspective. So, for example, in the early tradition, we don't encounter the idea that there are parts of ourself, facets of some fundamental nature that we need to integrate and make whole. In, the early tradition, there's no attempt to focus on and try to figure out, who we are, in and of ourselves or in relation to, a greater whole, a greater universe. Instead, in early Buddhism, it has us consider that these things, this thing we take to be a self, is really just a somewhat haphazard collection of activities, patterns, and tendencies. In the early tradition, you might think of it as we're a collection of actions, not things. We're verbs, not nouns. The view that the early text has us consider is that all of these aspects of our experience are ancient patterns, impersonal inclinations of life, and we're chock full of what are called latent tendencies. In the early tradition, there is no stable or enduring pieces of parts, no core, no essence. We're compounds, piles upon piles of habitual actions. And as we know from evolution, you might think of it as that we can see how these habitual actions have been cobbled together over countless past lives, given our evolutionary trajectory. So, for example, that self-critical voice, it's not a part of ourself. It's a cobbled together, harmful habit that we picked up from the environment. It's a habit that, like a stream, may have cut a very deep channel in our minds. Now we can try to understand, it's good to understand, what self-judgment might be craving, right? But it's not a channel that we have to accept, not if that current of mind, causes harm. We can cut a new channel in our mind in a different direction if we want. So overall, our minds have all kinds of habits, based on often primordial karma. These states and acts are often aimed at survival and continuation. They're aimed at pleasure seeking and pain avoidance. Now, these states are understandable and they're natural. And when they arise, we might pause to comprehend and account for them. But as forms of dukkha, something that we're making, we can also discover how to do something different, make something different. In the view of the early tradition, we don't have to accept the habitual creations of mind, the actions of mind, as the final, human response. So just to say, just to wrap up, actually, I try to portray the early teachings to the best of my understanding. And even if I've perfectly mirrored them, perfectly portrayed them, I trust that we all know that it's not a matter of, saying that this is the doctrine and we're supposed to do what it says. We're supposed to believe what it says. We are definitely not, I hope supposed to accept these notions uncritically. Instead, I think it's important to experiment and to play around with different approaches, right? See what you like. See what approaches work for yourself. See for yourself.